I'm pleased to say that the econometric science was something that I learned about for the first time today. So I'm happy that we have someone who is trained in it to join us tonight. If you don't already know Michael, he is a former chief economist at the Beer Institute. He is now the founder and chief economist at 7th Point Analytic. You can find him at Econ Beer on Twitter, where he shares a host of really great insights, charts. He does a really great job at making it easier for us to do our job. So I highly encourage you to find him, reach out, and use him as a source if you can for the reporting that you do. Speaking of which, hey, Michael, welcome to tonight. Thanks so much for being here.
There we go. Hey, thank you, Brian, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Very kind words. Thank you. Because I'm so busy with project work lately, I have been tweeting a little bit less of my fancy charts and graphs, but that is really good for you tonight because that means I have some saved up. So we'll go over some.
In all fairness, there's a lot of oldies but goodies, I think, in your Twitter feed, some of which I think will either kind of maybe call back to, or a lot of us will see for the first time. So here is how we're going to do things tonight. Michael, thank you very much for preparing some of these charts and stats you're going to share with people. What we'll do is we'll talk a little bit first about what you brought with you tonight to share with everybody, and then we'll go through some prepared questions that people had submitted already. I'll remind everybody, if you have any questions to ask tonight, you are welcome to put them in the chat box. You can DM them to me directly. You can just post them for anybody to see if you like. I will also give you the opportunity to ask questions directly. You can hop on the video and ask audibly of Michael. Okay, so let's jump into it so we can start learning a little bit. Michael, I'll switch things along. Feel free to send me a note in the chat, or just let me know when to move along. But
I'll just tell you.
that's fine. I'm good with audio cues as it is anyways. Ears are open, eyes are ready, mind is open as well. So let's talk a little bit about what you brought to share with us tonight.
Yeah, well, so definitely we can talk about these graphs that I've got, and also please interrupt me with questions. That goes for you, and I assume it's fine for you to take questions on the chat, because I want to keep this not only like informal, but also relevant to what people are thinking about. So obviously the industry has been through a ton of change recently, and this is a look at one of the ways that change has manifested over the last couple of years. So obviously we all are aware that the on-premise shut down hard about roughly 2 years ago, a little tiny bit more than 2 years ago today. And so that had a really dramatic impact on draft versus package beer sales. But what I wanted to point out to folks is that you can see in this graph, which represents the change in 12-month moving volume of package and draft beer in millions of barrels. So packaged beer jumped way up and it stayed up, but it's not any longer quite as much higher versus, you know, back with what the world used to be like back before the pandemic started. If packaged beer fell down a little bit, and it has started to smooth out. Similarly, draft dropped like a stone. Obviously, that's going to happen because the whole on-premise world was shut down on purpose for a while. But then, you know, even as it has started to come back, it isn't quite all the way back for a lot of reasons. I think the two biggest ones, anecdotally, I think, but I think it really makes sense. The big reasons are that one, in a lot of cases, folks are still precluded from going out and enjoying the on-premise the way they would want to normally, because either they have to wear a mask or because other people around have the, there's other people around and they may be concerned about the risk of getting COVID. Additionally, there's a lot of folks still with lingering financial stress coming out of the pandemic. So it's true that there are a lot of jobs available now, but it isn't necessarily the case for everybody that people are back to the same level of income that they had prior to the pandemic. So a lot of difficulty spending as much money as sometimes folks would like to, and additionally, still lingering COVID concern for a lot of people. But what I wanted to point out here is that, like the package trends, the draft trends have started to level out. Okay.
Michael, can I ask you a question about this too, which may be relevant for some of the other things we talk about? A lot of what we think about in terms of comparisons and to get a good sense on how things are performing and what's doing well or what's not really has gotten screwed up over the course of the last couple of years because of that. There's a huge boon in packaged beer sales, and that's kind of, as you were showing, maybe reverting back to lower levels, but still higher than historical levels. Is there an easy way right now to think about comparisons for, when we look at April 22 versus April 21 versus April 20? Are these things that we should just keep in mind as things are not going to look, normal for a while there?
Yeah, so I'm going to say yes and no. For one thing, in beer, I fought this when I first started in beer. Back when I was interning at Miller Brewing Company in 2007, there's a really strong and closely held belief that we should be comparing more or less everything to what happened the same period a year ago. And I came in trying to say, like, let's do seasonal adjustments and let's look at what happened this month versus last month. And you can do that. So in answer to your question, yes, you can do that. A lot of people don't. I think that there are some useful things that can be gleaned from that. And and our colleague Bart over at the Brewers Association, he sometimes shows seasonally adjusted change versus prior month or prior quarter or what have you, things like that. And that can be useful. Another thing that I find, folks in the beer world have a little bit more comfort around, and it's also useful in terms of longer term fluctuations, is you can look at 12-month moving trends, which is what I showed on the last chart, and I have it in a lot of my stuff because that is a way that we can look at what's typical, right? So like 0 on this graph would be typical if we consider 2019, calendar year 2019, a pretty typical year, and I think it was for most purposes. And then we can look at the change versus that. So I think that is a useful thing, certainly.
I want to just call out, Kelly had a question posed in the chat. So based on these numbers, pandemic 2020 was up dramatically in both draft and package over 2019.
Not exactly, no. So what we're seeing here, these orange bars, they fall below the 0 line there. So what that means for, December 2020, that, I'm just looking across here, that means draft for the full year 2020 was something like 8 or so million barrels less. That's just looking at this graph. I'd have to double check the numbers on some spreadsheets that I have. But these orange bars are negative, and then the blue bars all being above 0 are positive. So that means that in December 2020, that's 12 months. That means, looking across here, that total packaged beer for the full year 2020 was about 10 million barrels more than it was in 2019.
Okay.
Explain how to read my graphs. So, obviously a lot of things have changed, and I mentioned that before. one of the things that we saw during the pandemic was the big dramatic switch to off-premise, and that has been talked to death. But the reason I wanted to just mention this here is that so a lot of times in our industry and in many industries, when we see a really sudden change that's brought about by something that is impermanent, like say a global health crisis, we see a big change. We see this ramp up in total beer supply. But then what happens is, depending on what the change was, it often will go back to the way it was at about the same rate. And that is why you see this line coming back down again. And this is the latest data that we have from TTB, which is through December. And, you know, if we're tracking the full year volume, or excuse me, 12-month moving volume throughout 2021, which we all were, you get to middle of the year and things are looking really great. Our volume was up over 6%. And then in the back half of 2021, that started to fall off really hard. And so I don't have any bets down in Vegas on where the industry is going to end the year 2022. But if I did, I would have some money on we are going to be down in 2022. And the reason, apart from like, you know, costs are up, prices are going up, so those things make sense. But additionally, we are lapping some pretty tough comps. And so it is going to be hard to turn that around. And, you know, we're seeing a lot of signs that a lot of people are struggling. I've been reading on the tweets that a lot of breweries are up for sale.
And this is something that I think I found particularly interesting over the last few years. And also, I think maybe a part of what you were just talking about too, Michael, where, you know, it's not just comparison to previous years that makes things look maybe a little bit funky for beer, but it's what's happening elsewhere in the market. So tell us a little bit about the shifts and changes that we're seeing with these, the traditional alcohol categories.
Yeah, so it's definitely true that a ton of stuff happened in beer, and a lot of us are closest to that. So we saw, okay, big shift to off-premise, and along with that goes a big shift into packaged beer, a huge demand, a huge spike in demand for aluminum cans, and actually a shortage of aluminum cans, followed by a shortage of glass bottles, and a little bit of beer growth. Beer doing honestly better in terms of overall volume than it's done the whole time I've been in beer. But all of it coming in dramatically cheaper options, right? Because when folks shifted the 17.5% or so of total category volume that typically moves through bars and restaurants, when all of that volume shifted into off-premise, it's suddenly a quarter or so the price of what you would pay for the same beer in a bar or restaurant, and people could afford a lot more, so they start to buy a lot more. And that's why there was, you know, that's one of the many reasons there was a large increase in sales for brands that were already well positioned to have strong, dependable brands that were available in 12 or larger count packs, many of them in cans, most of them in cans. And that happened in beer, but the shift was even more dramatic in wine and in distilled spirits or hard liquor. So the premiumization trend that we've seen in beer for a very long time, that's present across many categories. They're not even all just consumer categories. There are all kinds of different categories. Pretty much anything that people spend money on is premiumizing right now. And that's true in wine and spirits. But when folks moved from on-premise into off-premise, and they started buying their wine and spirits there, there seems to have been an even greater increase in the total volume. So last year, spirits volume increased by, I believe it was 9.3% total spirits volume, as reported by Discus, and the Wine Institute has reported an increase of 10% in wine volume just in 2021. And that's compared to slightly more, I think it was 1.3% increase in beer volume in 2021, which is outstanding for us, by the way. Like, again, beer has not had growth over 1% in quite a long time.
I want to call out a couple of questions that got posed in the chat box just to help clarify what we see here too. So on the left of this chart, Michael, we go all the way back to immediately after World War II, where beer was a little bit over 60%. I know in the mid to late 90s, it also reached a relative high, and then it was basically 2004 when things started to decline. Michael just wanted to confirm the fall of the total category volume from 60% in 49 to 45.7 in 21. So was that the high in 49, and then we are at a new low in 2021?
I believe if you take this graph a bit further back, if you go into years prior, no, actually it gets even higher share for beer as you approach the end of Prohibition. So coming out of Prohibition, beer and wine were really heavily favored because they were considered more temperate. And distilled spirits was at the time, widely considered the least temperate of the alcohol categories. So it did not have the share that certainly that beer had. And, so coming out of the Prohibition era, people started to open up more to the different alcohol categories. And so spirits started to gain share from beer. Then in the early 70s, we saw the dawn of light beer, which really took the world by storm at the time. And that is the driving force behind beer's share growth from, the early 70s through the mid 90s. And then starting in the early 80s, there was this new thing that nobody had ever heard of called craft beer. Actually, at the time, it was called like micro brewed beer. There were a few other names for it, but at the time, it was this tiny thing, and nobody had ever heard of it. I remember being on stage at the BMI conference in 2016, I believe it was. I was up there with Bart on one side of me and Lester on the other side of me. And I was saying, like, if you look at the different segments share in the beer category, there was popular beer, which was what it was called at the time. Now we think of as economy beer, or, basically cheap beer. There was premium beer, and it went up. And then there was light beer, and it went up. And now we have sort of the like amalgamation of craft and import beer, and that is getting to a really decent share. But it looks like it might turn a corner and start to have a struggle. And in a lot of ways, we're seeing that. And I said at the time, there was this tiny line that was just starting out, that was FMBs. And I said, if I am looking at the way what later became the last 4 number 1 segments, I would say it's not crazy to say we're going to see a lot of growth out of the FMB space sometime soon. But I know that sounds crazy. And the thing that caused all the growth that would be what we now understand as FMBs and hard seltzers was hard seltzer. So
Yeah, let's clarify too, because I did call these the three traditional categories of alcohol. Kelly wanted to confirm here from the TTB, that's the government agency, where does seltzer fall in these three segments?
it's a really good question, and I should address cider as well, because my good friend Michelle over at the Cider Association would probably not be thrilled that I have left cider off of this list. So for throughout most of the history of this graph, all cider volume was counted under wine, and the seltzer volume, almost all of it. So for my purposes, when I'm analyzing this, I just consider it, all of it falls under beer. And the reason that it falls under beer is because most of it is taxed as beer. So there's actually a distinction in terms of regulation between the TTB and the FDA. And if it's not traditional beer, it tends to be more often regulated by the FDA in terms of people's health. But for tax purposes, the IRS still considers it beer. So most of it is counted under beer. The one caveat with that is that there are some that are and purport to be spirits based. And so those ones, which are few and of relatively small volume, those are reported in the government statistics as hard liquor, but it's so small that I consider it negligible.
And one last one for this chart too. Gerard wanted to help clarify with this beer and hard liquor, the trend lines there, asking, is the growth of beer always inversely related to that of hard liquor spirits? Because we look at it here and it's pretty much a mirror image.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So is it always? Well, we're looking here back 70 years, right? So for our purposes, yes, it always has been. Will it always? I don't really know. We're looking here. This is an important point. This is a look at share, and share is always zero sum. So if one of these categories goes up in terms of share, then another one, at least one other one, has to go down. Beer lost 2 share points in 2021, and that is huge. We dropped below a 50 share of total alcohol servings a few years ago. And at the time, there were some people raising alarms saying this is a big deal. And there were a lot of other people, and I think there are still a lot of people saying this is not a big deal because share of volume doesn't really matter. What really matters is share of the money that, people are spending. And, to an extent, that's true. But what I try to remind people of, especially in the beer world, is that, in order to cover your fixed costs, we do need to have our tanks full. And we have a certain number of tanks. And so we have a growing capacity underutilization issue. And that will eventually lead us to have some difficulties. And like I said earlier, we're seeing some difficulties now where people are having trouble affording all the tanks that they have. And, some breweries are up for sale.
Well, let's talk about who might be having some of those issues. Here, you broke things out in terms of what was happening to breweries of certain sizes. What do these numbers mean?
Yeah, so there's this concept in economics called optimal firm size, and it applies also to optimal plant size. So for a manufacturing facility, how big that facility is can determine how successful the company is in the marketplace. What this actually shows here is the change in the share of output among small brewers. And when I say small brewers here, I'm talking about those defined as small brewers by the tax code. So that is breweries that have an annual output of 2 million barrels or less. 2 million barrels or fewer? I'm not sure. Either way, all of the breweries that have like 1 to 2 million barrels of annual output are included on the share change at the far left there, and the tiniest breweries that make less than 1,000 barrels a year are on the farthest right, and it's it goes down in size from there. So basically what we're looking for here is, okay, is there a range of sizes where over the last 10 or so years breweries of those sizes have been doing relatively well, and is there a range of sizes where breweries of those sizes are doing less well? And it's really, really clear on this graph that in terms of small brewer capacity, anything over 500,000 barrels per year is losing share. And much bigger than that, between 1 and 2 million barrels a year, is losing a ton of share over this period. And then what's the right size below 500,000 barrels per year? There kind of isn't one. You can, it seems, the evidence suggests that you can have a really strong, profitable brewery at any size below 500,000 barrels per year. And that's really important because I get asked all the time, and Brian actually asked me recently, what is like the most breweries we can have at the 13 share, or 13 or so share that craft is? And the answer is there isn't a maximum number. Breweries can be really profitable and actually just as well performing jointly at under 1,000 barrels as they can at 30, 100,000 barrels. So, we could, over the next few years, continue to see decreasing median brewery size. Or, it's not crazy to think that we could see that median size increasing. The median brewery size is, as folks on the call probably know, is very, very small. I believe the median size, we could double check with Bart on this, but I believe the median brewery size is under 10,000 barrels per year, because most breweries out there are pretty darn small. That doesn't mean that most of the volume is made in breweries of that size. But no, I mean, it's not crazy to think that we could have twice as many breweries in 10 years. I don't think that's going to happen, but it may. And certainly if anybody asks me right now, if I'm going to build a brewery tomorrow, how big should it be? I would say, please, please, please do not build a brewery over 500,000 barrels per year in capacity. And anything under that, I think the evidence is split. You can go ahead and do any size you want under that, and you can survive.
Yeah, just some extra context for these figures that we're looking at. So when we think about size that below 1,000, depending on who you ask, Brewer Association or other trade organizations, like the majority of breweries are less than 1,000 barrels a year. The most consistent numbers is somewhere between like 2/3 and 3/4. So 66 to like 75% is pretty consistent in terms of what I've heard in terms of everybody across the country. So does that, when we see that as 2%, is that just is that good considering the sheer size of businesses that would be in that category? Especially because we look at these numbers and we see less than 1,000 barrels is, the smallest of these growths, but it also includes the most number of businesses as well.
Yeah, so each of these buckets of sizes of breweries has gained, there's 15 to 30,000 that is the biggest by far there, but like they're all in a pretty tight range of how much share they've gained over this period. And so what that means for the smallest one is that same share gain is spread across many, many more breweries. And in the case of, say, 100 to 500,000 barrels per year, that's like a handful of breweries that have gained about the same amount of share. So what that means in terms of what I consider the right way to interpret that is that there are good, strong business models that can exist across this whole range, and the right size for any particular brewery depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But you can be really strongly profitable anywhere in this range. Above 500,000 barrels, that tends to be, in order to make that much beer, you're going to have to sell farther away from your brewery or at a lower price to the point where you're not making enough money.
Oh, one more question about this. If, say, I were a journalist, and if I were to be looking for maybe stories locally or regionally that I might want to pitch to publications, if I wanted to maybe try to find something, a business where the most exciting thing is happening, for good or for bad, I guess, where there is great opportunity and growth, or maybe it's hitting a point where, exciting but maybe tough or potentially challenging decisions have to be made in terms of how to grow and where to grow. Looking at these numbers, can we get a sense of what kind of size brewery, maybe as a journalist, we would want to look around to find these exciting stories of where these both like these growth spurts and like growth points happen that might offer up good stories?
Yes and no. I'd say that what this data right here suggests is that more or less everywhere you look, you're going to find rich stories where good, hardworking people are doing incredible things. On the small side, in terms of the very smallest brewers, and that's where the majority of the breweries are, you see like this new and exciting thing, really small, really local, hyper local to a place, because they're not selling enough to get well beyond their own doors. And in some cases, many cases, folks don't sell beyond their own doors. They're just selling on premise only. There are, many hundreds of those, and they're all over the place. And that's really great. The ones we tend to read about the most are the ones that have some name recognition, right? I get asked sometimes, what's a mistake? I don't know if I'm got the right audience for this, but what's a mistake that I see beer writers making? I see sometimes, when a mid-sized brewer puts something out there or makes a change of any kind, a lot of times it makes a splash and it gets a lot of attention. It's, there's a lot of ink spilled over it. But in a lot of cases, it's like a PR stunt done for a little bit of earned media. And, maybe that's good. Maybe that it helps the brewery. It helps, beer writers have something to write about. But the thing that I, as a reader myself, want to know about is what's new and exciting. And then, in a lot of cases, that's the really smallest stuff. And then the other thing too is what's going to move the needle, what's going to actually change the way the industry is working. There were, I don't know how many dozens, probably hundreds of breweries that started selling hard seltzer because hard seltzer was going to be the thing and everybody wanted to be in the thing. But just because people are flocking to, buy the new iPhone when it comes out doesn't mean you should try to make a smartphone. Like, I think that, you know, craft brewers should not necessarily be chasing the thing that is selling volume for the other guy. And I think that the success stories that I've been looking at lately are, you know, stories where folks really understood their niche and they knew just what they were really great at, and they stuck to that.
Well, if I were a journalist and if I wanted to talk about or think about something topical, this is something that might catch my eye. Of course, one of the things that you had mentioned earlier, Michael, is just rising costs. If you buy things, you know about what this is like just walking through the grocery store. So tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here in terms of what these costs are and what people are paying.
Yeah, so we know, because a lot of the audience here today has been writing about it, that input costs are rising for brewers, and that is a fairly recent phenomenon in, you know, the last what, 6 to 12 months, something like that. Brewery costs have started to go up, but it's crazy to me to see how little that had been related to price changes until recently. So what's shown in this graph is, on the horizontal axis, that is breweries' costs, like how much they're outlaying for the beer that they're producing. And this is, I should say, it's US breweries. It doesn't capture the costs of, say, your Heinekens or your Coronas that are made abroad. But then on the vertical axis, it's showing the price index for beer that consumers are buying, and in particular off-premise, because that's the majority of the volume, and increasingly so. During the pandemic, there started to be this big disconnect between the costs that brewers were facing and the prices that beer drinkers were facing. And that is why, you know, I put in this 45-degree line here to show, normally we would expect this line, and for a long time it was, from 2012 to, you know, about 2020 or so, it was consistent that brewers were increasing their prices at roughly the same rate that their input costs were rising, were increasing. And generally that should be the case. We should be able to expect that, unless there's some kind of dramatic change in the industry and in pricing strategy and in the way breweries are doing business generally, we shouldn't be seeing the prices of the beer that people are drinking increasing faster than the prices of input, you know, the input costs that breweries are facing on the back end. But during the pandemic, we started to see this go crazy. And the reason for that was not, at first, at least, that the input costs that breweries were facing were all that different. It was the fact that, you know, suddenly demand for off-premise beer just spiked like crazy, and there wasn't anything else that, you know, retailers in particular, but also brewers, could do to keep beer in stock, but to increase the prices faster than their input costs were increasing. But on this graph here, you can just see one little lonely dot at this blue dot that's at the farthest to the top of the graph and farthest right. That is the most recent data showing that now that costs are increasing at a more dramatic rate, we're seeing a closer relationship once again between the increasing costs that brewers are facing and the prices that get reflected at retail that drinkers are actually going to pay for the beer that they consume. What all this means is that, as crazy as it may seem, because I know that the costs are increasing quite dramatically, we're actually getting back to what I consider a normal or even healthy state of where the costs that a household is outlaying for beer is going back now to where it's accurately reflecting the changes in costs that breweries are facing. And that is a good and normal thing in terms of sustainability for the industry. The thing that I'm concerned with is you can see that, so that one dot there, the most recent period, it's not only back to closer to that 45-degree relationship that it should be, but also, if you notice there is a big gap between that dot and all the other dots. And the reason for that is, boy, our price is increasing quickly these days. Oh, man. And if we keep on seeing these big gaps month to month between each successive data point, that is really going to start to hurt industry volume, because what that means is that people are outlaying an even greater share of their disposable household incomes on each beer that they buy costs more and more and more. And we've got a healthy, we're going back to a healthy relationship between input costs and output goods. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the situation is great.
I'm gonna pause for a moment. I have a question that I would love to ask about all of that, but I do want to check to see if anybody else has a question. Michael just did a marathon session walking us through. This is all really great, wonderful stuff. And again, like these are things that don't come up normally in conversations. So if you have a question right now, I'm going to pause in case you would like to unmute yourself and ask Michael before we dive back in. So I'll give you a moment if you'd like to do that.
I would just like to say that I'm impressed that you can do all those number talks drinking Old Rasputin. So good job.
It's not just regular Old Rasputin. Thank you. First off, thank you very much. It's not just regular Old Rasputin. This is rye barrel aged Old Rasputin.
Well, so this is fair. I'm going to jump back in and ask a question because I can segue directly from that, because so Michael, I want to go back and I'm going to tie together a couple of slides. Speaking of rye barrel,
let's do it.
So let's talk about this slide, which is what we talked about, the difference between the way beer was declining in servings and the others were increasing, and this slide where we're talking about prices, because for something like this, this is prior to the pandemic and the way that impacted both the supply chain and prices. Beer was already declining. And then in this slide, you were talking about how, at least in the time being, the cost for brewers is outlying the cost at the store. And so when I see things like that, I immediately think, okay, so beer was already in a not great place. And now we're talking about whether beer needs to play catch up with the prices that it increases. And like you just mentioned, prices across the board are changing fast. What should we take away when we think about both of those charts together?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So at various times, beer's intrinsic characteristics that differentiate it from wine and spirits are sometimes a blessing, sometimes a curse. So a thing that hurts beer a lot compared to wine and spirits is that it's really heavy. For how much value you get out of a case of beer, it literally weighs a lot, and you get a lot more value out of a case of distilled spirits because it's more concentrated, right? I'm looking over there. I got a bottle of rum over there. That's that particular bottle is 52% alcohol by volume. That is a lot more alcohol than you would get in the same size volume of beer, right? And so that is something that frequently hurts beer. But something that usually hurts beer right now is actually kind of good. So beer has this really short shelf life, right? Compared to like wine and spirits, you can't, as a retailer, buy beer and have like, especially, you know, Old Rasputin, not so much, but for your Bud Lights of the world, you can't have a package of Bud Light sit on your shelf for 2 years, right? Whereas a bottle of whiskey, rum, etc., or a bottle of Merlot, in general, that can sit there for a long, long time. So I don't know if everybody in the industry knows this, but wine and spirits companies have stockpiles of product because two things. Unlike beer that takes about a month to make, depending on what you're making, you know, a bottle of whiskey generally takes a lot longer than that. A bottle of wine takes longer than that. So they have stockpiles, but in order to compete during the pandemic and to meet all this excess demand that came out of nowhere, the wine and spirits companies, a lot of them drew down those stockpiles. So it's only just now that we're seeing, in some cases, a shortage of certain wine and spirits products because they spent some of the pandemic drawing down those stockpiles. And so it's only going to be just now that we're going to start to see the types of changes in price that we saw in beer affecting wine and spirits. Now, the reason they have stockpiles is you hope that the stockpile is going to help you weather the storm. We haven't seen yet how quickly is on-premise going to come back and to how dramatically is it going to come back. But you know, if we'll go back, Brian, to that slide that you showed, I think it's like the second data slide, this one. Sorry, the next one. This one here. You know, as beer starts to revert back to where it normally was, that's contraction in the overall category, but it ends up being growth in draft. That may be a great thing for beer in the short term in terms of share performance, especially given that wine and spirits prices I'm expecting to start to increase more quickly than they have been. But you know, that decrease in overall category volume is going to hurt. Whether it does really great things for on-premise and for draft or not, it's going to hurt the overall category. So it's really important for us always to remember that it is sheer volume that keeps our trucks on the road. Okay, but yeah, for certain folks, as on-premise starts to come back and wine and spirits prices start to outstrip beer price increases, if and when that happens, and I'm hoping I'm right, that particular part of it should be a tailwind. And when I say a tailwind, what I mean is that's one of the things working in our favor, but don't get it twisted and think that we're out of the woods because if that happens, because we still have plenty of headwinds.
We'll go for maybe about another 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to pause again. If anybody has a question to chime in and ask, I will take a moment. You can unmute yourself and ask away.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Julie. If you got a question, fire away.
I do. I'll put my little raise hand thingy down.
Hi, Julie.
So, sorry.
Hey.
Hi.
I don't think we've met. Nice to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you, Michael. Thank you for doing this. I was curious if you have, is there any data or do you have any data in particular on like macro price increases versus like craft price increases in retail that we've seen so far?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not my specialty in terms of like what I sell. The Nielsen and IRIs are out there, and I know that Brian has loads of that data, right? So like Brian can
So hit up Brian
Let me-
for all the.
Michael, if it's okay, Julie, I may add on to that question to a way that Michael might have some insight, because I think, Michael, you and I may have talked about this before as well. Chime in, Julie, please, if this does or does not help. When we hear about the largest companies like AB or Molson Coors or Boston Beer saying, we're going to raise prices 5% this year, because the things that we're using are more expensive and we need to make up that money. And we don't yet experience that at the grocery store. Like, is that true, or are they just kind of blowing hot air?
That's a really good question. So there's tons involved in this. First off, broadly speaking, Julie, most of the industry tends to move together. And the reason for that is that so most craft brewers, in terms of their pricing strategy, most of their strategy is like, we cost 20% more than Boston, or we cost, they have their prices largely pegged to somebody else's price, somebody who has a big research budget and has lots and lots of smart people working on their pricing all the time. So that tends to be how they move. But actually, in the short term, when they announce a big price increase, you got to remember that's the price that they're charging their distributors, and their distributor doesn't have to pass along all that price change. And forgive me if you can, my kids are screaming a little bit down there. And additionally, the retailer doesn't necessarily have to pass along that price change either. And everybody has their own inventories. So distributors tend to build up inventories before a price increase hits. Retailers tend to build up inventories before a price increase hits. Many retailers actually charge below cost for their beer to increase foot traffic anyway. And so everybody's margins are variable. It could be the case that it takes a good long while. And, I've done studies on how long does it take an increase in like the cost of barley to hit all the way through to the cost of a Bud Light. And I haven't done that for a few years, but I think folks would be surprised how long it takes. Last I looked, I believe it takes a good 9 months for an input cost to hit the retail price of beer. And that's just beer. Remember what I just said about wine and spirits pricing is even more lagged because it takes so darn long to make it. Does that answer?
Sure. Yeah, no. I just, I have some concern about what's to keep distributors from absorbing the price increase on macro brands and not passing that along to retailers versus smaller craft producers that are aligned with the same distributors that have to take a price increase, and then the consumer doing a substitution at the retail level.
Yeah, okay, so I totally understand that concern. It makes a lot of sense. The thing that I would hope would protect most of the industry from that is that the distributor has an interest in maintaining a portfolio of brands, and any change in the relative price of his their macro products versus their craft or their import products or their other, whatever stuff they have, that is a meaningful change in their pricing strategy. And the big distributors don't actually do that sort of thing lightly. Like the Reyes Group, they care a lot about their pricing strategy, and they are not going to make dramatic changes in their pricing strategy based on the blowing of the winds of one supplier's pricing versus another.
Okay. And is it okay if I squeeze in one more question while I'm unmuted? Is that
It's
all
okay
right?
with me, Brian.
Yeah, fire. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm here.
No, I was just gonna this could be another Brian question. I don't know, but I just wanted to ask, do you know of any like opening rates as far as retail outlets, like for on and off premise? Because I know that we lost a lot of on premise during the pandemic. I didn't know if there was a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel and if we see some comeback in that area.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I would hypothesize that we won't have seen a return to growth in terms of the number of outlets buying. Probably some return to growth in the number of on-premise outlets buying, just because some folks have reopened doors. But I mean, the number of outlets that are out there with alcohol licenses that could be buying, my best guess is I don't think that we should have seen that yet, because what we know for sure is that the draft volume hasn't come back. And so that will be when that happens, if it happens, that will be a sign that I would take really seriously in terms of the return of a healthy, robust on-premise.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for that. I'll do one last call.
I don't know the answer to that, Mike.
Buffalo Wild
I'll
Wings,
ask my
largest draft customer.
I know some folks there. I'll tell you what, Mike, I'll send you the email of a friend I know who works there. Okay.
It's not Maggiano's Italian Grill or whatever it is. Do
they sell beer? I don't know.
Or Pizza Hut. Cool. One last call. If you have a question for Michael, in the meantime, while we give that a pause, I'm going to put the contact us form in the chat box so you can reach out to Michael as well. Does anybody have a question before we call it a wrap?
I do. So I made a comment earlier, so it's not two questions, so I hope that's okay. But so I had one of my kind of like things that I've sort of hung my hat on is to watch the industry and kind of take a look at market share per brewery. And so your market share across the three different supplier tiers, looking at the growth of breweries across that overall, I haven't seen anybody really be able to talk intelligently about how much each individual brewery is losing market share across the whole perspective. And so if the 2022, we did 20 million or whatever it was, but we added an extra 2,000 breweries over the last 3 years. Like, how do you see that going forward if we don't slow down the growth and the net effect of new breweries coming into the market?
It's a good question. And it relates to all of the brewery sales that we have going on right now. Boy, my son Connor is really having a fit down there. We see a lot of breweries for sale, and a lot of folks might take that to mean, boy, oh boy, if we look at the ones that are for sale, and I don't know and wouldn't share if I did which particular breweries are for sale. I know that there's a lot of buzz going on. We could look at those and we could say, oh man, that type of business model doesn't really look healthy right now. The data says different. What the data says is that there's going to be a few breweries in each of those sizes that fails. In general, they're doing well. Okay. And actually, in general, small breweries of all sizes, smaller than 500,000 barrels, are doing well. So if
the caveat I'll ask you is, well, by what metric? What do you mean by that?
On net, breweries of those sizes are jointly growing. Okay, so some of them of a particular size may be declining, but that decline is being made up for by other breweries of that size. And that particular business model seems to be doing well on net. So, you know, I personally, because I care about my clients, obviously. I care about a particular brewery when it comes to the success or failure of anybody that I care about everybody's job. I care about everybody's business. I care about making sure that every person in beer does well to the extent they can, but not everybody's going to do well. And so what I spend most of my time on is what's the health of the industry? What's the health of breweries generally, right? And because we all have a shared long-term interest in the health of the category as a whole. And it may seem cold to say that we need to weather some failures, but as long as we have more openings than we have closings, as long as we have breweries that are keeping their doors open and doing the kinds of healthy adaptation that they need to do to survive, I honestly think that we're doing just fine. I was talking to a mid-sized brewery on the phone 2 days ago, and they said, our sales team these days is about we had to fire 4 out of 5, lay off 4 out of 5 of our salespeople, right? And that was terrible. And they told me every single one of those folks landed in a good paying sales job in a different category or at a different brewery. And our brewery is just as strong as it ever was. And we're getting by just fine. So as long as we have those stories to tell, I think that we're going to be okay.
With that, we will leave it in the state of go out and find those stories. Michael,
yeah, and call me. I mean, I'm here. I'm around.
Yeah, the Michael's contact in the chat box. We will share the link as well when we post this too. You probably got a good taste tonight of what Michael can share to help your reporting and help you better understand what's going on around the industry. Michael, thank you so much for your time and putting all this together. Really great stuff.
Thank you, Brian, and everybody. I love all of the good work coming out of the Guild. I think that you guys are all really fantastic, and you are the reason why I know what's going on in the industry apart from a few data sources and clients that I have. So thank you all.
Hopefully we get to see everybody in Minneapolis in just about a week and a half. Until then, good night, everybody. Thanks for being a part of this.